The reel had been running for 6 hours. That was not unusual. Post-production on Eyes Wide Shut had stretched across months, then more months, the process folding back on itself in a way that those working inside it had long since stopped trying to explain to people outside. Stanley Kubrick did not finish films. He refined them. He circled and circled the same material until something inside him registered a stillness he could not define but always recognized. The editing suite at Childwick, his estate in Hertfordshire, had become a kind of sealed environment, climate-controlled, time-dissolved, running on its own logic. It was early 1999, January most likely, though the exact date would remain uncertain even to those who were present. The winter light through the narrow windows was colorless and thin. The room smelled of cold coffee and magnetic tape. Kubrick sat in his usual position, not at the front of the suite, not commanding the space the way a director was supposed to command it, but slightly back, slightly to the side, watching the monitor the way a man watches something that is almost right but not yet. He was 70 years old. He had not released a film in 12 years. The assistant's name was Matthew Rife. He was 24, had been working at Childwick for 8 months, and had learned very quickly that the rules inside that building were not the rules that applied elsewhere. You did not speak unless spoken to. You did not offer opinions on the footage. You anticipated, you prepared, you stayed. He had been hired to manage playback cues, to handle technical requests, to ensure that whatever Kubrick needed was available before Kubrick needed it. He was good at his job. Quiet, reliable, largely invisible. On that particular afternoon, Rife was preparing a new queue of reference tracks, ambient recordings, temp music, a collection of contemporary material that had been assembled earlier in the week for potential use in the film's sound design discussions. Nobody had specified the order. Kubrick had not asked for it. It was preparatory work, the kind of thing done at the edges of sessions. Rife made an error. It was small, the kind of error that happens when attention fractures across multiple tasks. He loaded the wrong folder. Instead of the ambient reference tracks, the playback cued a collection of recordings that had been compiled separately. Not for Eyes Wide Shut, not for any immediate purpose. Simply music that had accumulated on the system over time. Personal selections. His own. The session was in a brief pause. Kubrick had stepped away from the monitor, was standing near the window with his back to the room. Rife, thinking nothing of it, pressed play. The first sound that came through the speakers was feedback. A low, sustained drone, not aggressive, not sharp. Something more like the sound a room makes when all other sounds leave it. Then a guitar. Then a voice. Rife's hand moved toward the stop button. Leave it. He left it. Kubrick did not turn around immediately. He stayed near the window for several seconds. Long enough that Rife began to wonder if he had misheard. If the instruction had been for someone else. If there was someone else in the room he had forgotten about. There was not. The song playing was Kurt Cobain's Heart-Shaped Box. The recording was from In Utero, released in September 1993, the third and final studio album from Nirvana, made during a period when the band's internal architecture was quietly collapsing. When Cobain had already begun the long retreat inward that would end 14 months after the album's release. The song's opening is deliberate, almost patient. The guitar line moves in a single direction, contained, not climbing toward anything. Then the verse arrives and Cobain's voice arrives with it. Not loud, not strained, something closer to resigned, as though the emotion behind the words had been compressed past its own expression and came out flatter, thinner, and in that flatness somehow more true. Kubrick turned from the window. He said nothing. He crossed the room and sat back down in his chair. He watched the speaker, not the monitor, the speaker. The song lasted 4 minutes and 40 seconds. During that time, no one in the room moved significantly. A technical assistant near the back door stopped typing. The editor, who had been reviewing notes, put the notes down. Rife, standing at the playback console, remained standing. When the song ended, there was approximately 3 seconds of silence before the next track began automatically. Go back, Kubrick said. Rife went back. From the beginning, he restarted it. Kubrick listened to Heart-Shaped Box 3 times in succession that afternoon. Not 3 times with discussion between each. 3 times continuously without conversation, without note-taking, without visible reaction. The third time, he closed his eyes at some point during the second verse and did not open them again until after the song had finished. Then he asked a question that no one in the room had expected. "When was this recorded?" Rife told him. 1993. The album was called In Utero. "And the singer?" "Kurt Cobain," Rife said. A pause. "He's dead," Kubrick said. It was not a question. "Yes, 1994. Another pause. Longer. Kubrick looked at the speaker again, the way he had looked at it during the song. Not as a piece of equipment, but as something that contained something. "How old?" 27. The room was very quiet. Kubrick did not respond to that. He turned back to the monitor, and after a moment he said quietly, to no one in particular, he understood that there are things you cannot approach directly. Then he asked for the next reel. What happened in the 3 or 4 hours that followed was not unusual by the standards of that editing suite. Work resumed, footage rolled, notes were made, the session continued on its track, and the song was not mentioned again that afternoon, not by Kubrick, not by anyone else. The room had a way of absorbing things, of taking what entered it and folding it into the ongoing texture of the work without marking it as significant. Those who worked in that environment had learned to do the same. But the next morning, Kubrick asked Rife to compile everything he could find on Cobain. Not on Nirvana, on Cobain specifically. Interviews, footage, recordings from different periods of his career. He did not explain why. Over the following week, the material was assembled and played back during sessions. Not as background, not as reference. Played and listened to in the same mode that Kubrick had listened to Heart-Shaped Box the first time. There were other songs from In Utero, Rape Me, Dumb, Pennyroyal Tea. There were recordings from the MTV Unplugged performance, November 1993, 2 months after In Utero's release, 4 months before Cobain's death. There were early recordings, rough and tape-worn, from the Aberdeen years. There were sessions that had never been officially released. Kubrick was not looking for music to use in the film. The film's score was already determined, had been for some time. What he was doing was something different, something closer to the attention he gave certain photographs. Images he would study for minutes without speaking, without apparently reaching any conclusion, simply looking. There was a particular moment, recounted later by Rife, during a playback of the Unplugged session. The song was Where Did You Sleep Last Night?, the final song of the performance, a traditional blues piece that Cobain had been singing since his early teens. The recording is well known, Cobain's voice breaking open in the final verse, the neck of his guitar resting still in his hands, his head dropping forward slightly in the last moments of the song. On the tape, you can hear the audience completely silent. Then they exhale. Kubrick watched it without moving. When it ended, he said, "He's not performing there." No one responded. "He's not performing," he said again, more quietly. "He's just telling you what it is." Eyes Wide Shut was completed in early March 1999. Kubrick delivered the final cut to Warner Brothers on the 2nd of March. He died 7 days later in his sleep at Childwick, Bury. He was 70 years old. The cause was cardiac arrest. The film was released in July 1999, 4 months after his death. Matthew Rife did not speak publicly about the events of that January and the weeks that followed until 2010 in a single interview given to a small film journal based in London. The interview was not widely circulated. He had been reluctant to speak, he said, not because the events were unclear in his memory, but because he was uncertain how to describe what had happened without either overstating it or reducing it to something simpler than it was. He described the afternoon that Heart-Shaped Box came on by accident. He described the 3 consecutive playbacks, Kubrick's closed eyes, the question about Cobain's age. He described the week of listening that followed, the unplugged tape, the early recordings, the attention that was neither research nor pleasure, but something between the two, something closer to recognition. The interviewer asked Rife what he thought Kubrick had recognized. He was quiet for a moment. "I think he recognized someone who had found the same problem," Rife said. "Not the same solution. Kubrick and Cobain were nothing alike in how they worked what they made, what they wanted. But I think Kubrick heard something in that voice that was solving the same problem he was always trying to solve, which is, how do you make something true without explaining it? How do you make someone feel what a thing is without telling them what it is? Kubrick spent his whole career on that problem, and I think he heard it in Cobain and it stopped him. The interviewer asked if Kubrick had ever returned to the subject. Once, Rife said. About 2 weeks before he delivered the cut, we were in the suite very late. It was just the two of us. He was looking at the last sequence, and he said, out of nowhere, he said, "The boy knew something." Just like that. Then he went back to the footage. He paused. I didn't ask him what he meant. You didn't ask him things like that. But I've thought about it since. I think I know. What Kubrick heard that January afternoon, what arrived unannounced through an error in a playback queue in a sealed editing suite in Hertfordshire, was a voice that had already understood something about the nature of proximity. Kubrick had spent his entire career working at the outer edge of what could be shown, not what could be depicted, what could be shown, made present, made felt. He believed in indirection. He believed that the moment you named a thing directly, you destroyed it. That emotion survived only in approach, only in the space between the thing and its expression, only in what was withheld. Every film he made was, in some structural way, a study in that principle. Cobain had arrived at the same place from a different direction. He was not a studied artist. He had not apprenticed in any formal sense. He had absorbed everything he heard and inverted it, distorted it, stripped it down until what was left was not a song about pain, but pain inside the shape of a song. Not a performance of grief, but grief that had forgotten it was performing. The voice on heart-shaped box does not explain its own desperation. It contains it. The song does not tell you what it means. It tells you what it is. That distinction, the difference between meaning and being, was the same distinction Kubrick had been working toward across 5 decades and 13 films. He heard it in 4 minutes and 40 seconds. He asked to hear it again. Kubrick never made another film after Eyes Wide Shut. There is no way to know what the following years might have produced had he lived, what he would have made, what he might have absorbed and transformed in the decade that didn't happen. The ideas he was developing, the projects under early consideration, remained unfinished, unstarted. But in the archive at Childwick, among the materials that documented the final months of his working life, there are records of those January sessions, the playback logs, the listening hours, the careful, unhurried attention given to a voice that had been silent for 5 years by the time Kubrick encountered it. Matthew Rife made an error with a playback cue. A song came on that wasn't supposed to come on. A man in a sealed room turned around and listened. And in the last months of the last film of Stanley Kubrick's life, something that Cobain had left inside a song found its way into a room where it was recognized, held, and quietly understood. The editing session continued. The footage rolled, and no one in that room was quite the same afterward, though none of them would have said so at the time, and most of them would have struggled to explain exactly why. Some things you cannot approach directly. Cobain knew that. Kubrick heard it.